team of truth-seekers is on a mission. Scientists, historians, archaeologists, all on the trail of history's enigmas. Searching for the truth behind the greatest mysteries known to humanity. Carved into the Peruvian landscape, something unnatural, something otherworldly. Monumental geoglyphs painted across the dark desert floor. We know them today as the Nazca lines. But how were such monumental images created? Who was responsible? And most importantly of all, why did they do it? In London, our team assemble. Our 4 truth-seekers combine decades of experience in different fields. But they all have one goal: to apply their knowledge and reveal the truth.
There are mysteries, and then there are mysteries.
I have always loved uncovering the secrets of the past.
We need to go back and unpick the untruths from the truths.
Age-old problems that we've been asking ourselves over 100 years, really, can now be solved.
They'll follow the clues left behind, unravel the secrets of the past, separate fact from fiction, and together they'll uncover the truth behind the greatest mysteries ever. It was 1927. An archaeologist was conducting a dig at a burial site in southern Peru. One day, he took a walk among the hills that surrounded his excavation. As he climbed to the top of a high dune, the windless rocky desert spread out before him. Looking down over the arid landscape, the archaeologist spotted something strange. As he looked closer, he saw lines. Some straight, but others curled through the desert with geometric precision. Put together, they almost looked like a picture. That day was the beginning of a mystery that has intrigued and baffled scientists for generations. Later flights over the Peruvian desert revealed hundreds of ancient geoglyphs, pictures carved into the earth.
What I find so fascinating about the Nazca lines is not just how they were created, but all the mistakes that we have made as modern-day experts in trying to explain them.
Why scratch these vast images into the earth when they could only be seen properly from the sky?
As an anthropologist, one of the things that most intrigues me about the Nazca lines is that they're actually not a unique phenomenon, this idea of artwork created on the Earth's surface itself. We see them across cultures and through time. But I always want to know why an individual culture did it. Why did the Nazca create these lines?
It's not just one monument, but it's actually hundreds of monuments that are built on massive scale. And they stand out, even on satellite imagery, you can see it. You can effectively see these lines from space. We're gonna naturally wonder, what is this? What are they? Why are they, where were they built? And who built them?
These strange lines clearly tell some kind of story with all those fascinating images, but it's something we're still trying to decipher. There are many theories about what these people were actually trying to say or convey in these very kind of alien images.
Tony McMahon has been taking a closer look at the site and its earliest explorers.
The Nazca lines are located in southern Peru, about 400 kilometers south of the capital, Lima. They're located on a high-level desert plateau between two rivers.
Many of the lines are simple, narrow paths that radiate outwards for kilometers, like spokes on a wheel, connecting with each other in a giant web. Elsewhere are vast geometric shapes, triangles and trapezoids, hundreds of meters across. But Nazca is most famous for its smaller and more complex figures. Animals, birds and insects, creatures, both real and imagined.
The geoglyphs include a hummingbird, a spider, a monkey with a very large spiraling tail. Some of these creatures native to the area and some of them from much further away.
Animals like the monkey are found in rainforests far from Nazca. How and why their pictures came to be scraped into the desert floor is a mystery. Who were the travelers that brought knowledge of these creatures? Who were these geoglyphs actually for?
None of the lines were hidden, and there's the perfect conditions for their preservation. There's little rainfall, it's dry, 40 kilometers from the coast. So the lines were there waiting to be discovered when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century.
These European soldier explorers crossed the Atlantic to expand the Spanish Empire into the Americas. But for the indigenous people, it quickly became a nightmare. The conquistadors destroyed the Aztecs in Mexico and the Inca further south. Among their newly conquered lands were the high plains in southern Peru, where they found a desert marked with strange lines.
In the accounts by the conquistadors, they describe the Nazca lines as trail markers or roads. Now, sadly, the invading Spanish didn't just bring war and a new religion and new technologies to this part of the world, they also brought disease with catastrophic effects.
The indigenous population had no immunity to illnesses like smallpox and typhus. Devastating epidemics ripped through the ancient communities. Within a generation of the fall of the Inca Empire in 1572, the Nazca Valley was almost empty.
This human suffering essentially wiped out the local people, wiped out their culture, their monuments which were torn down, and that knowledge of what these lines were about, that was completely wiped out.
It seemed that the Nazca and the riddle of the lines in the desert were doomed to be forgotten. But then, in the 19th century, an unseen style of pottery from South America began to appear in European museums. Where exactly they came from was a mystery, but their complex motifs and startling, vivid colors captured the imagination of scholars working in a new field of science, archaeology.
Archaeology was still in its infancy when in the early 1900s, the German scholar Max Uller came to the area investigating pots, and he found them in the south of Peru.
More archaeologists followed. They began to piece together evidence of an ancient culture that lived between the Andes mountain range and the Pacific Ocean. They named them the Nazca.
It wasn't until the 1920s that the Peruvian archaeologist Toribio Mejia Hesper worked out what the lines were. Initially, they just seemed to be paths to nowhere, but it was while hiking in the hills that he realized what the Nazca lines actually were.
The true scale of the pictures could only be seen from above. Soon, planes were chartered to fly over the desert with photographers on board. Their pictures and the mysterious carvings they revealed became global news.
The photographs showed a kind of confusing entanglement of lines stretching in different directions for many kilometers, and in between and over those lines were these strange geoglyphs of animals and birds.
More archaeologists were soon journeying to Peru to try to unravel the mystery of the lines. They concluded that the people who once lived here appeared to possess only rudimentary technology and no written language. How did they manage to construct such precise drawings?
What the archaeologists began to figure out was that these ancient Nazca had scraped away the reddish-brown pebbles at ground level, revealing the kind of yellowy undersurface. And this was a painstaking process. The creation of these long lines over such huge distances really wasn't that complex for an ancient civilization. Essentially, you place two sticks in the ground and somebody stands there and guides another person on where to put the third stake, and so it keeps going on and on. There's even evidence of this been found at Nazca with the remnants of stakes at the ends of some of these lines.
A modern experiment proved even complex shapes could be made with such techniques.
A group of archaeologists in the 1980s decided to test their own theory about how these people could have created these geoglyphs, and they, within a period of about an hour and a half, managed to create a 35-meter spiral. So if you want something similar to the tail of that monkey.
The experiment showed that the Nazca didn't need to have great geometry or engineering skills to create the lines in the desert. There are over 1,300 kilometers of lines etched into the earth over an area of 50 square kilometers. They are usually only a few centimeters deep and no more than half a meter wide. They differ in placement and style, with only 70 of the iconic zoomorphic designs and hundreds more geometric. It's clear that these weren't the focus of a given period or whim of a single ruling elite. These geoglyphs were carved into the earth over a period of 1,000 years and held a key place in Nazca and wider Andean culture. But there was no obvious answer to the greatest question of all: why the lines had been made.
The most curious aspect of the Nazca lines is that you have these lines which are straight and intersect each other, and then you have these geoglyphs overlaying them. Now, does this all have one purpose, or was there one reason for the straight lines and another for the images of animals and birds?
In the decades since the first lines were rediscovered, archaeologists have found hundreds of carvings among the rocks and hills at Nazca. In recent years, modern technologies such as drones and 3D scanning have identified yet more, some of them barely visible to the naked eye. With each new discovery, the mystery of the Nazca Lines deepens.
There's still a huge amount to be found. After all, we have these enormous drawings made by these ancient people over a vast period of time, and we still don't understand why did they do it.
The Nazca Lines have been measured and cataloged with scientific precision. We now know for sure how they were made. But the bigger mystery, what we don't know yet, is why and who or what for. In South Peru, between the Andes Mountains and the Pacific Ocean, there once lived a people we now know as the Nazca. For centuries, they carved images and shapes onto the parched hillsides and deserts of their homeland. But by the modern age, the Nazca civilization had long since fallen. Their secrets had been lost, and their great works of art forgotten. In London, the team of archaeologists and historians are gathering evidence and examining the different theories that might explain why this ancient people built the Nazca Lines. Dr. Mark Altaweel is an expert in data analysis, using the latest tools and technology to examine the past.
What I find so interesting about the Nazca Lines is the fact that they can be created at such large scale, that they had such wonderful symbolism. It's not just simple creatures, but they're in some ways mythological. So it makes me really fascinated in seeing such a diverse range of geoglyphs built at such large scale.
Ever since the rediscovery of the lines in the 1920s, mapping and categorizing them has been the mission of many archaeologists in the region. One of the first major studies began in the early 1940s. It was led by an American professor from Long Island University named Paul Kosok.
He's a historian by background, but he trains himself to be an archaeologist. And one of the things he's really fascinated is trying to bring new technologies, new techniques to understand archaeological problems. And at this time, aerial archaeology, what we would call today remote sensing, was just beginning. And he wanted to have airplanes help solve some of these mysteries.
In June 1941, Kosok was in Peru researching the irrigation systems of ancient cultures when he heard about the strange lines carved into the desert further south. He decided to investigate further.
His first theory really was that Nazca Lines somehow were ditches that were used as a way to irrigate the landscape. This is a very dry part of South America. Irrigation would have been a key technology that would be used for agriculture.
With only 4 millimeters of rainfall per year, the Nazca Valley is one of the most arid regions on the planet, with average temperatures in the high 80 degrees Fahrenheit. With very little cloud cover, access to fresh water would be critical to maintaining a healthy population and avoiding annual drought, malnutrition, and starvation. But this remote and seemingly hostile region also had some natural advantages. Caught between the cold Pacific Ocean and the high Andes, any mountain rainfall would need to pass through this valley on its journey to the sea.
Perhaps the water channels would have taken water from the mountaintops, for instance, down into the valley. But once you come close to these lines, practically you don't really see how they could have been water channels. They're quite shallow, they're not very deep, they're not really dug that deep really into the landscape.
Professor Kosok soon developed another theory, however. He happened to be on the site of the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. That was when he noticed something. He was standing by the hummingbird drawing. He saw that as the sun dipped towards the horizon, It aligned directly with the beak of the hummingbird. It gave him an idea.
And he looked at the beak area and he noticed that this line was quite straight, that potentially it may actually align with the stars, that there may be some kind of relationship, not necessarily with what's going on with irrigation on Earth, but rather the night sky and the stars themselves and other sort of astronomical kinds of features or observations. After some time, he put this idea together that perhaps not just the hummingbird, but rather all geoglyphs were basically trying to tell a story of when to harvest, when to plant, that they were effectively an instruction manual communicating with the stars.
Professor Kosok began mapping the Nazca lines. But when he left Peru after his final expedition in 1948, his work was unfinished. It was taken up by his assistant, an adventurous woman from Germany called Maria Reich.
She had come to Peru to be a tutor for the children of diplomats from the German embassy at the time. She was highly educated, gifted in understanding astronomy, mathematics, and a number of different languages. And because of World War II, she had to effectively stay in Peru. But there she fell in love with the landscape, and she also had a chance to meet with Paul Kosok. She got to know the Nazca lines and the archaeology of the region, and eventually she took over, and then she carries on his legacy and his work.
Maria Reich continued her studies at Nazca for the next 40 years, measuring and documenting every geoglyph she could find. She lived alone in a tiny house out in the desert. She took flights over the lines by plane and helicopter. If they weren't available, she would just climb a ladder. Anything for a better view.
Maria Reich becomes really obsessed with the Nazca lines. Now, Maria Reich was, of course, a gifted archaeologist, but she was also able to bring her skills and training that she had learned as a young woman, which were mathematics and astronomy. So she brings all these skills together, and after some time, she develops Paul Kosok's theory, which is that not only are these geoglyphs really part of a vast astronomical book, but rather the geoglyphs are representing entire constellations, that they're basically groups of stars.
She may have led a hermit's existence, but Maria Reich had an instinct for publicity. Her story of a charismatic and eccentric loner dedicating her life to these mysterious lines in the desert captured the imagination of the public. She wrote a book about her work called The Mystery on the Desert. The profits from the book were put to good use. Reich hired security guards to protect the Nazca lines and lobbied the Peruvian government to ensure their preservation. It was greatly through her work that the Nazca lines were recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1994. Reich's efforts catapulted her theories to global fame. But there were those who had their doubts. Were the Nazca lines really a map of the stars? In the 1960s, Reich's theories were put to the test. The American astronomer Gerald Hawkins analyzed the Nazca lines using what was then groundbreaking technology, a computer. His software included star positions dating back thousands of years. He was able to compare this data with the Nazca lines. According to Reich's theories, Hawkins should have found a match.
He determined that the stars had obviously moved significantly from where they are today, but that the alignment with the Nazca lines doesn't really work out very well. In fact, it's quite random. Some lines sort of match the stars, other lines clearly do not. So this representation the Nazca lines gave, that they were aligned with the stars, doesn't really work out, and it's just a kind of random mix, really.
In 1996, Donald Proulx, a professor of anthropology from the University of Massachusetts, traveled to South America. He came to Nazca to conduct preliminary research for an archaeological survey. There, he met another American, a man named David Johnson. He was a teacher from New York. He was in Peru helping local communities find water in the dry desert.
In fact, the villagers in Peru had asked him to come help them find water in their villages. So Poole gets quite excited when he meets him, because he begins to talk about the importance of water and perhaps that these geoglyphs were associated with water in some way. There seems to be a kind of correlation between certain ancient water features with geoglyphs.
Professor Poole agreed to help Johnson investigate. Their work led to a new theory to explain the Nazca lines, one different to any suggested before.
They become fascinated with these features called pukyos, basically these kind of spiring-looking features in the landscape, which are basically underground water channels that were built by ancient people, Nazca people and others, to channel water across the landscape. Now, there's an association of subterranean water, as well as the pukyos, with geological fault lines. So the idea is that the geoglyphs may have actually acted as a kind of marker or a feature in the landscape that would indicate where subterranean water could be found, kind of map, if you will, of where one should look.
Johnson suggested that the large trapezoids indicated channels under the earth where groundwater could be found. Zigzag patterns showed the boundaries of the water flow, and triangular geoglyphs pointed to the sources of the water themselves.
The idea that there's a kind of geological or even physical map of where underground water would lie is not that unheard of. In fact, we do the same thing. The importance of water is really paramount. So what we do is we often mark these areas where underground water can be found. So why not expect ancient people to have a map that would indicate where water sources were?
With funding from the National Geographic Society, in 1998, Poole and Johnson took a team to Nazca to test the theory. They investigated sites all over the Nazca region. It was the first time in history that such a survey had taken place there.
Now, Poole was quite intrigued by this hypothesis, but thankfully, in many ways, he's a true scientist, and that meant that he created these hypotheses based on these ideas. So he got together a multidisciplinary team, and he went to the field using multidisciplinary kinds of methods to test out these ideas, not just accept them, but simply test them one by one to see if they work.
They worked long hours in the searing heat of this barren land. They had all the data they needed and took it back to America for analysis. But just like many archaeologists before them, their theory wasn't scientifically provable.
Now, statistically at least, there's no strong relationship between the underground water and the geoglyphs. However, it doesn't mean that relationship doesn't exist. It's possible that the geoglyphs have multiple purposes, and so some of the geoglyphs may have been, in fact, markers for underground water.
But if the Nazca lines were not a map to the heavens or to fresh water, then what were they? One truth seeker believes the truth is to be found in the Nazca people themselves. Who were they? Why did they carve these lines in the desert? Who were they trying to communicate with? Scraped into the deserts of southern Peru, the huge engravings are one of the world's great unsolved mysteries. There are countless theories about who made them and why. Anthropologist Dr. Karen Bellinger has been investigating the ancient people who may have carved the lines.
When most people think about pre-Columbian South America, the Inca pop to mind immediately, and for good reason. They created these monumental sites, such as Machu Picchu, and their capital city of Cusco. But it's really important to realize that the Inca were a flash in the pan compared to the people who constructed the Nazca lines. They were around for 1,000 years before the Inca rose and fell. And so if we want to understand the Nazca lines, we've got to examine that civilization.
Around 1200 BC, an ancient Peruvian people, now known as Paracas, arose in a coastal region just north of Nazca. They were farmers and artists, famed for their colorful pottery and intricately embroidered textiles.
The Paracas left no written records, but they did leave a wealth of archaeological evidence in the form of subterranean burial chambers, which housed mummy bundles and artifacts that were preserved perfectly for 2,000 years because of the dryness of the desert environment. From excavations, we know now that the Paracas never built the kind of grand monumental architecture that we associate with the Incas, but they had an incredibly sophisticated artistic tradition, which reached its pinnacle in incredible textiles and ceramic production.
But it wasn't just with pottery and textiles that the ancient Paracas expressed themselves. They also carved images into the earth.
It is during the Paracas period that we see the emergence of geoglyphs in this area. They tend to be on the smaller side, often human topics, and carved into hillsides.
In around the 3rd century BC, groups of Paracas migrated south. In the valleys of Nazca, they settled in tiny villages in the banks of the Rio Grande. There they lived and flourished for the next 800 years.
The Nazca were primarily farmers. They grew corn, potatoes, peppers, beans, and cotton. But they also were located near enough the sea that they could exploit those resources for easy protein.
But they took their old Paracas traditions with them as well.
The Nazca inherited the Paracas artistic traditions and continued them in textiles and ceramics. They also inherited the Paracas tradition of etching drawings into the earth. And here is where the Nazcas really outdid themselves. By the 1st century AD, the Nazca were their own distinct cultural group, and that was reflected in the lines they were drawing on the ground.
Instead of digging into the hillside, the Nazca began carving images into the desert floor itself.
It was a vast blank canvas for the Nazca, and it was in between the geographical boundaries of their lives, the mountain and the sea. It is on this canvas that we see a shift from smaller, more human forms to larger, often animal forms. Well, it seems to have coincided with the emergence of a new unified Nazca religion.
Just south of the Nazca Plains lies the temple city of Cahuachi. For centuries, it was the ceremonial heart of Nazca life. The site contains more than 40 mounds, natural hills that the Nazca adapted to their needs. Some were used for burials, others for religious ceremonies. They were topped with buildings and surrounded by walls and passageways, plazas, and platforms.
We don't know exactly how Nazca society was organized, but what does seem clear is that it was a group of individual tribes that were unified not by a single political authority, but rather by a shared belief system.
The Nazca believed that supernatural forces controlled the elements and the fates of humans.
They believed that powerful mythical creatures controlled the availability of water and thus the viability of agriculture.
Shamans were the intermediaries with the spirit world. They used hallucinogenic drugs to induce visions, and they led the rituals where offerings were presented to the gods. These included pottery, animal sacrifice, smashed panpipes, and human heads.
Archaeologists have recovered dozens of severed heads at the site of Cahuachi, and they show evidence for having been very deliberately processed in a uniform way. The soft tissue, the brains, have all been removed, and the lips are sewn shut with cactus spines. And holes have been drilled in the foreheads to permit them to be strung along on a rope. Headless skeletons have been found which show clear cut marks in the spinal column near the skull. And that would have been done with obsidian knives. It would have been slow-going and brutally hard work. Contrary to early beliefs that these victims must have been war enemies, is that DNA testing shows that they're Nazca people. This is evidence for likely human sacrifice.
Human sacrifice was common among the ancient peoples of the Andes. For the Nazca, the rituals of decapitation appear to have been linked to renewal and fertility.
There's iconography showing plant life growing out of the mouths of these trophy heads depicted in textiles and ceramics. These are farmers in a very harsh land. They're caught on a desert between the mountains and the sea. And they've got to ensure, however possible, that water is available for their crops to grow. So this becomes a clear way in which they hope to propitiate the gods and beg for their blessing in the form of water.
Many scholars today believe the Nazca lines were part of the same web of ritual and belief.
Given how close the Cahuachi complex is to many of the Nazca lines, there's got to be a correlation between the two.
Rituals that involve walking along set lines to holy places is still a feature of indigenous communities in Peru today. Such pilgrimages were likely a part of Nazca life as well.
There's one amazing figural work of ceramics, and it depicts what has been interpreted as a family walking in procession with dogs dancing around them and with birds perched on their shoulders, possible offerings to be made.
The Nazca journeyed to Cahuachi for ritual feasts and gatherings, traveling from settlements in the mountains and at the coast. Many of those routes would have taken them through the desert of the Nazca lines.
The lines depicting the hummingbird, the monkey, the killer whale, they correspond to ceramic motifs, and they symbolize the powerful forces of air, earth, and water.
There is considerable evidence of human activity among the lines. Broken pottery and panpipes, animal offerings, and even possible remains of building structures.
It's possible that the lines were sacred paths taken by the Nazca on their pilgrimage to Cahuachi. They're about the width of a footpath, and there are many in straight lines. And in fact, people looking at them have identified compression in the soil as opposed to the area outside the line. And what could have created that? People's feet.
Where the Nazca lines pathways to water or to ritual sites to bring water forth from the gods, we know that their lives were precarious. They lived at the mercy of the elements, and the lines were a response to that. But that hasn't stopped other theories taking hold, some that will take us away from Peru, around the world, and to planets beyond our imagination. The Truthseekers are investigating one of the world's most enduring conundrums. Why did an ancient people in South America move tons of earth and stone in the middle of a desert to create vast drawings that they themselves could barely see? The Nazca lines were rediscovered by modern science in the early 20th century. Our team of Truthseekers have learned much about the people who made them, about their art and their religious rituals. But despite their efforts, the purpose of the Nazca lines remains a mystery.
In the 1920s, when the lines were rediscovered, this really was a period when we had very little ability to acknowledge the agency of indigenous ancient peoples. There was a real prejudice towards a belief that the Nazca could have produced these lines themselves.
Cultural historian Dr. Fern Riddell has been researching the more unusual theories about the Nazca lines.
We've tried to understand how the Nazca could have created these lines without things like aeroplanes or helicopters. Some of these theories have ranged from the idea that perhaps the Nazca invented hot air balloons and that allowed them to look down on the Earth, or even that there may have been a shared ancient code between civilizations like the Babylonians, the Romans, the Nazca, that allowed them to construct these incredible structures.
The most famous and influential of these theories belongs to the Swiss author Erich von Däniken. In 1968, he published a book called Chariots of the Gods. It claimed that the technologies and religions of many ancient civilizations were given to them by ancient astronauts, aliens who were welcomed on Earth as gods.
Däniken's theory of alien astronauts is this belief that alien civilizations came to Earth at moments when we were really at the dawn of our civilizations, that they landed and that they created ancient religions and kind of set the human race on its path. So from the Nazca lines in South America to Egypt to Russia, we can find, as he felt, evidence of these alien civilizations' impact on us.
Von Däniken's explanation for the Nazca lines was that long ago, aliens had landed on the arid desert. Their spaceships blasted away the stones, exposing the lighter ground beneath, creating these lines. And once they left, the Nazca drew new lines to encourage their return.
Once the alien gods or the alien astronauts had left, the Nazca were desperate to try and call them back. So they created their own markings in kind of retaliation to draw the aliens back to Earth. These wonderful spiders and fish and images that could perhaps be seen from space.
Nevertheless, von Däniken's book became a bestseller. It sold tens of millions of copies and made its author a very wealthy man.
When Däniken is publishing in the 1960s, this is really the heyday for our obsession with sci-fi and with space. Combined with that, you've got the countercultural revolution in the West. Every aspect of life was being questioned by New Age beliefs. You've got a huge change taking place: the moon landings, potential nuclear war, Watergate, UFO sightings, all of which told people that the truth was being hidden, that there were conspiracies out there. You can understand why, in that climate, von Däniken's book was so successful. It was both revolutionary and reassuring. It tore down the pillars of society, history, and religion, while offering a neat and comforting explanation for the mysteries of the world in a time of upheaval and change.
Mainstream historians and scientists have long pointed out the many errors in von Däniken's work. But it still finds new believers, and it continues to inspire pop culture. Hollywood films such as Stargate and Ridley Scott's 2012 horror, Prometheus, both owe much to von Däniken's ideas of an extraterrestrial origin for humanity.
The idea that aliens have had a hand in our civilization, in the creation of our civilization, is one we're still fascinated by. We've really kind of pushed our own ideas and our own understanding of ancient structures onto the Nazca lines, and that hasn't allowed us to see them for what they really were. And that's really denied the Nazca their own culture and their own agency.
The Nazca were not the only ancient people to etch images into the earth. North along the Pacific coast from Nazca, among the foothills of the Andes Mountains, what looks like a giant candelabra is carved into a hillside. It is visible for kilometers out to sea. Further south in Chile can be found the largest human geoglyph in the world, etched out of a mountain. The giant of Atacama is 1,000 years old and almost 120 meters long. And in western Bolivia, the Sajama lines are a network of thousands of crisscrossing straight paths. Etched into the ground, they cover an area 15 times larger than the lines at Nazca.
These ancient geoglyphs have been found in Russia, in Kazakhstan, Israel, India, and even in England. We have the Uffington White Horse. And they are an incredible example that in every culture, humans have wanted to leave their marks on the earth.
Like the Nazca lines, however, the purpose of these other carvings into the earth has long been debated by scientists and historians.
I think one of the problems we have in our modern world is we have to find a reason for everything. We can't just allow the lines to exist for art's sake. There has to be a specific construction, a specific explanation. And sometimes human beings just like to create.
These lines are clearly trying to tell us a story, but we've only been able to decipher part of it. It's a tale of human ingenuity, human sacrifice, life and death on one of the most alien landscapes on the planet.
I wouldn't be surprised if there are multiple meanings. Perhaps they're a way of storytelling. Perhaps they're just pathways connecting sites. Perhaps they are markers for things like water. So I'm happy to believe all these to some extent. If we think about our own monuments, there isn't just one meaning to them. They often change over time. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these ideas that have been proposed about them have some merit of truth.
It's only really in the last century, at most, that in-depth research has been done into the Nazca. They demonstrated great sophistication in adapting not just to live, but to thrive in these harsh desert conditions. They were truly remarkable people.
Although they left behind no great pyramids or walled cities, there remains a monument to these ingenious and artistic people in the lines they carved into the earth, lines which have fascinated us for generations. Lines which will go on sparking our curiosity and our wonder for many years to come.